And I also wanted to make sure that I also mention the other sponsors, because I see Ms. Nadia. I should have seen Robert here before, and I saw Orest, but I now see Nadia and Mr. Kuhn. US-Ukrainian Foundation as one of those original sponsors, and the American Foreign Policy Council, which is here today, has also been one of the sponsors that have been doing our best. Okay, on the first one, Jonathan, it's all yours.
Sure.
It's about democracy. It's going to be important. Thank you.
Just about democracy. Yeah.
Nicole, on the technical side, I think we have to shut this down.
Yeah.
Either that or we can stay and see that off.
You've got mail.
I think it's a good thing, brother.
I'm just going to use it. I'm going to use this, turn that one off. Yeah. I think that might work. Let's see if we can use the mic over there. Okay. I think this works. Good morning. Walter just wanted to thank you for being here. And obviously this is my second time being here. It's such an important opportunity to examine and look at what's taking place in Ukraine. I want to thank the ambassador. Very inspiring speech. Couldn't agree more with you, and I think it really is a sort of perfect segue to the conversation that we're having with some really distinguished panel. For all of you, my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and I'm also a co-chair along with Orest of the Friends of Ukraine Network, which is part of the US-Ukrainian Foundation, the Democracy and Civil Society group, and then also Orest and I also chair the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine. And as you can imagine, this year has been a particularly busy year, both in terms of elections, but also in terms of Ukraine's reforms. And I had an opportunity to be out in Ukraine for the first round of the presidential elections with NDI. And I think all of us sitting across the table here would agree that it was truly a free, fair, and transparent election within international standards. But I'm going to let the real experts on elections speak to these issues. And obviously this is a particularly important time for Ukraine. And I think when I think about this panel, I think about uncertainty in terms of what comes next, in terms of a parliamentary election that may or may not take place in July, but also about a new president that is thinking about next steps on policy internally, reforms, democracy, governance, rule of law. And this panel today is going to be looking at those very questions of where Ukraine is today, also where they need to go in the future, and also looking at the upcoming election as well, and the motivations, desires of the Ukrainian people as they look at next steps. And one thing I did want to emphasize too, how important it is, and I'm glad we're having this in Washington today, and by the panelists who are coming after us too, is how important it is for the United States at this moment, U.S. government, and supporters of Ukraine, the EU and others, to really strengthen support for Ukraine, and I think a very sensitive and transformational moment. And I think if there's anything that we sort of get out of these conversations is that obviously change in Ukraine will be created and it will be pushed and moved by the Ukrainian people and government, but the support of partners is essential. And I think the ambassador laid out all of the challenges, internal challenges and external challenges. And let's we not forget that there'll be an upcoming meeting between President Trump and Mr. Putin upcoming, and we'll be seeing, certainly the outcome of that, but also some regional challenges too that could impact Ukraine, including Moldova. And the ambassador mentioned the other regional challenges not to exclude the ongoing conflict in the East. So with that said, I want to turn to our panelists. I want to turn to Steve Nix with IRI, and then Katie Fox with NDI, and then my colleague Orest to bring up the end of this conversation. And Walter will try to do our best, and we have such excellent timekeepers out front that we will definitely keep on time, and we know we have panelists coming up behind. So Steve, could I turn to you first? And it just because of brevity, for all of you, just to take a look, everybody's bio is in this pamphlet. And so, but I'm pretty certain when I look across this room, it's in a lot of familiar faces that have been here previously or are following and working on Ukraine. And I think Steve, Katie, and Orest are some of the most well-known faces on Ukraine in this region in Washington, D.C., and have had extraordinary leadership, both from NDI, IRI, and also Orest with the Helsinki Commission, that I didn't feel like it was necessary to read the full bios. But please do so when you get a chance. And Steve, if I can hand it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. Thank you, Vladko, for organizing this. I actually like the concept of the timekeepers. It reminds me of being back in Arlington and Fairfax Circuit Court, where the judges gave counsel 3 minutes to argue their motions, and if you didn't finish on time, you were cut off. So I promise to be as brief as possible in my remarks, which I have asked today to address to you the recent presidential elections. I know everyone's primary focus right now is on parliamentary elections and whenever those might be held, but I've been asked to do some analysis and some retroactive viewpoints on the presidential elections, but if there's time remaining, perhaps we can discuss the upcoming parliamentary elections. First and foremost, IRI had a very big election-related program. We provided campaign training to all of the major candidates competing in the presidential election, but importantly for analytical purposes, IRI had long-term observers in Ukraine for 2 months prior to Election Day. Those observers remained for the second round. We had short-term observers in both of the rounds, first and second round. Our first round delegation was led by Mrs. Cindy McCain. Our second round was led by David Kramer and Congressman John Shimkus. Just a moment or two about Cindy McCain. She had never been to Ukraine, but really wanted to make this trip. And as you can imagine, it was a very emotional trip for her, given her husband's legacy and his status among the Ukrainian people. So a lot of emotion as we retraced his steps on the Maidan, and a lot of emotion displayed by the Ukrainian people who recognized her and came to her and thanked her for John McCain's great support for Ukraine writ large, but particularly for the military assistance that he personally spearheaded and led in the U.S. Congress. With regard to the reports, first and second round, we have to rate the election administration as continuing to dramatically improve in Ukraine. We had a fairly new Central Election Commission with a new head. We had a lot of new District Election Commission members, but our reports, and that's available on the IRI website, www.iri.org, found that election administration continues to improve dramatically. Whether that's the voters list, whether that's preparations, whether that's reporting, tabulation, we see dramatic improvements. The fact that an outside person was brought in to head the CEC, not an election expert, but an attorney, and we met with a lot of the young attorneys that she brought on board the CEC. So in terms of election administration, we saw dramatic improvements to the point where we found very, very few technical problems. Vladko remembers in previous meetings of this group, we were dealing with issues of the voter list, of carousel voting, of bribery, of some pretty outlandish events that took place during Ukrainian elections. That was at de minimis level in this particular election. So high grades to election administration. Secondly, the environment. The campaign was open. Candidates were free to express their platforms, their positions. It was a very active campaign. So we found, again, improvement in that particular area. There didn't seem to be interference on anyone's part in terms of openly campaigning. Importantly, Ukraine had an open-air presidential debate, as you all know, and many of you watched this, and this was astounding to us. And the very fact that the presidential hopefuls could debate issues in front of a live audience on national TV is another tremendous step in Ukraine's democratization. And I think you all know that the president of the Russian Federation authorized state TV to broadcast this debate. I think the theory was, the hope was, that this would be a disaster, that there would be problems, that there would be demonstrations, that this wouldn't be a healthy, substance-related debate. And it was. And the Russian people by the millions saw this. And so again, this is a tremendous step for Ukraine in terms of serving as an example to the Russian people of what could be in their own country. So we saw this as, again, a very substantial and profound improvement and a step towards full democracy. And then I would add to the fact that once the election results were reported, the president of Ukraine gracefully conceded defeat and actually offered to assist the president-elect in the transition. Again, a very dramatic step, and something that we have not seen historically in Ukraine. So a very smooth and peaceful transition, very smooth and calm environment. We can't talk about Ukrainian elections without addressing the issue of Russian interference. We all expected a lot of interference during the campaign and on election day and possibly post-election. It didn't materialize. The greatest demonstration of Russian interference in this election was the fact that Ukraine conducted an election that met international standards, certainly was given high grades by IRI's observation team, but this was done while Ukraine was fighting a full-scale war with its neighbor. So to pull this off is a great feat of arms, and I think the Ukrainian people need to be applauded. Importantly, because of this Russian interference, we estimate that 16% of the Russian population was disenfranchised. The 12% that live in the occupied territories, who, although have the constitutional legal right to vote, it's still very burdensome. You have to cross twice into sovereign Ukraine to register and then to vote. That proved burdensome for a lot of people. So you got 12% that were basically disenfranchised, and then the 4% of displaced persons that again faced procedural obstacles and were not able to vote in great numbers. And that's something that we have urged the Ukrainian government to pursue and to look into so we can increase those numbers. But again, that was the result of Russian interference. But by and large, we graded these elections very high, and that's a real tribute to Ukraine to be able to do this. Starting to run out of time, let me just fast forward. Now we await the decision of the Constitutional Court as to when parliamentary elections will be held. I'm an attorney. I practiced election law. I have my own interpretation of Article 70 of the Constitution as to whether this cause is constitutional, but my opinion doesn't matter. What matters is the opinion of the Constitutional Court, and a rule of law country, that's what should count. So I can't tell you how the court will rule. I can tell you that IRI is preparing for these elections. We are petitioning today, USAID, IRI and NDI are filing a proposal today that will allow us to have funding to quickly train campaigns that are competing in this election. And actually goes into early elections, local elections called for next year. So this covers both parliamentary elections and local elections. So we're preparing as if elections are taking place on July 21st because we don't know the outcome of the court. And again, it's fast-paced. Parties are trying to put their lists together, as you've seen and read. We're trying to put into place training programs. Part of that is some polling data. IRI just came out of the field with a poll, so I can't go into details with you because We've only briefed the Zelensky team, the Poroshenko team, Yulia's team, and several others. We have a few others to brief, and until that time, we can't publish the results. What I can tell you, it's very heartening to see some of these numbers. I can tell you that Ukrainian public support for EU membership is at an all-time high. I can tell you that Ukrainian support for NATO membership, as the ambassador alluded to, the importance of this for Ukraine, is at a historic high. It's never been this high. So those are two very encouraging signs post-election as we go into parliamentary elections, but certainly will be part of the new administration's foreign policy. We hope that this data can be used by the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry when they attend the NATO ministerial in London in 2 months. So those are important numbers. And of course, you can't talk about the polling without discussing the ballot test. All I can tell you is that Sluha Naroda has a commanding lead. You've seen some of the other polls. Our numbers are not that different. By our estimation, based on these numbers, when the 5% threshold is, the remainders are assigned to the 4 or 5 parties that look like they'll meet the threshold, it would appear that the Sluha Naroda team will have a commanding position and likely have an outright majority of the party list seats. Of course, this data is not predictive of the single mandate seats, but I would estimate that the Zelensky team will do well there too. But I'll sum up our perspective on parliamentary elections by going back to the Russia factor. While Russia's role was de minimis during the campaign, during the presidential election, we don't think that will remain the same for parliamentary elections. And what we have argued to the State Department and others is that the pro-Russian coalition, Oppositia Platform, will be the beneficiary of outside funding sources, social media sources, and that this group, with the support of a foreign entity, is going to target single mandate seats in the South and in the East, try to flood the zone, money and social media, to try to support these pro-Russian candidates. That, in IRI's view, poses an existential threat to the new government of Ukraine, the new parliament of Ukraine. You see where this argument is going. There are a handful of pro-Russian members of the Rada. But if this is expanded, then you might see a demand by this group of deputies for cabinet seats. And to us, that's just untenable for pro-Russian parties to have any kind of influence on the foreign policy, economic policy, the defense policy of Ukraine. So we'll be very watchful. We are targeting the pro-EU, pro-democracy parties that will be competing in this election. Obviously, we're very watchful of these pro-Russian forces that will be competing, and I think we all have to be very cognizant of the threat that they pose to Ukraine. So in sum, thank you. My time is up. Presidential elections, very high grades among the subject matters that I shared with you today. Parliamentary elections, we'll see when they take place. We're trying to prepare. We look forward to similar, well-conducted, well-administered elections. We look forward to what we hope will be a peaceful and calm environment, but we're watchful for the outside influence that we predict will be present in the parliamentary elections. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Steve. I think I'm going to try to push this mic over to you too, or you could.
Maybe sit over. I need to sit over there because
Okay.
I don't have anyone to do the PowerPoint.
Okay.
I need to PowerPoint.
Do you want me to go
while I
there?
speak.
Steve, thank you for that, both a recap of the presidential election, but also a better picture of where the Ukrainian public is today on key issues, including Euro-Atlantic integration, which is really important, but also the threats, which I think are really threats present in this parliamentary election period. And I wish you Godspeed as you engage the U.S. government to try to get them to act quickly in this period. Katie, you ready?
I am ready. Thank
Okay,
you.
hand over to Katie.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Vlad. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, everybody who's organized this conference. We're very pleased to be invited every year. So I am going to try to set the scene a little bit for you. NDI, like IRI, monitored the presidential elections and was monitoring the parliamentary elections. Sorry, okay. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. And in addition, we also do public opinion research. Our research is a few weeks ahead of IRI's. No. We did our field work the last 2 weeks in May, and we've had our meetings with the major Ukrainian parties and players and the international community, so I am going to share some of them. I am going to share some of the highlights with you. Sorry. Okay, so let's start. As I said, this is from a survey that was conducted in the last 2 weeks in May. This margin there. Okay, I want to start by looking back at the presidential election. What this slide shows is that Ukrainians overwhelmingly think the presidential election was free and fair. Why is this important? I agree with Steve that there was not a lot of overt Russian interference in the pre-election period, putting aside the conflict. But what there was, the disinformation that was out there, the theme of it was that Ukraine is a failed state, Ukraine can't hold fair elections, Ukraine can't have a decent electoral process. Clearly, Ukrainians didn't buy that. Also, just a side note, this is in a different poll, but NDI, with a wholly new CEC administered these elections, as you know. NDI found that before the first round, there was very little trust in this new CEC because it was so new. But after the first round went really well, the levels of trust in the Central Election Commission went way up, which is also an interesting side. Next one. Okay. What is the main reason Zelensky won? The point of this is it was all about newness and secondarily about Poroshenko potentially not living up to people's expectations. It was much less about any particular issues or even any qualities. Zelensky is a blank slate to people. They are projecting onto him what they want to project onto him, which is both a challenge and an opportunity from a democratization perspective. You can say a little bit more about that later. Okay, what is the main reason Poroshenko lost? Poroshenko didn't keep his promises. He said he was going to address falling living standards and corruption and end the war in the East, and he didn't. Ukrainians, especially since the Revolution of Dignity, expect a lot of their politicians. They expect promises to be kept. Expectations. Yeah. So this is, NDI does surveys every 6 months, so this is, you can see over time, what issues Ukrainians consider most important, very consistent. 3 issues Poroshenko tried to address: rising prices, the conflict and corruption. You can see on the blue bar, the conflict is edging out a little more in May, and prices are a little bit of a less, but it's pretty consistent. Okay, so this is the optimism slide, and this is interesting because it shows you a very, very high ratio of people who are optimistic to those who are pessimistic. You can see in the center north, it's 7-1, which is really high, and it's flipped. In national, it's 3.5 optimists to 1 pessimist. That's prior to the election, it was the other way around. It was 2 to 1 pessimist. So a lot of, across the country, really a lot of confidence in the new government and a lot of hope that things are going to change. Again, a lot of confidence and a lot of hope. He's, obviously he can't do everything that everybody wants, but there is a very widespread expectation among people that they personally will get what they want out of the new administration. As I said, I think this creates a potential for high expectations that can't be met, and then the disappointment that sets in afterwards. But it's also, I guess, an opportunity for Zelensky to demonstrate he can be responsive right out of the gate. Well, see what people care about. Negotiating peace is right up there with, removing immunity is right up there with negotiating peace. Very, very important to Ukrainian people. This gives you a clue to what people are looking at if Zelensky wants to fulfill the most promises for the most people. And here, this is what Steve was saying. Our polling found the same thing. You see the blue bars, record high numbers supporting membership in the EU and membership in NATO. Those are the blue bars over time. Okay, looking ahead to the parliamentary elections. Zelensky, again, way ahead on the likes or dislikes. Zaryckyj, he's the only other one who's in the positive territory. Senko's not so bad. But this is, again, the blank slate factor. He hasn't shown himself yet, and the tendency is in Ukrainian politics that once people become known, there's a disappointment. I think he's really enjoying a honeymoon because he isn't known. Very high interest in voting. Parliamentary elections are held tomorrow. Would you vote? Very high interest, you can see in the East. Actually, East and West are not too far apart. They're within a margin of error, so that's good. Okay. All right, I'm going. Okay, so here's which party would you vote for? Servant to the People is, as Steve has said, way out there. But even higher is no preference. People haven't made up their minds yet. And what I think this means is Ukrainians have high expectations. Ukrainians, it's not enough to just be new. You need to actually deliver something for Ukrainians. I think that's the main change that we've seen after the Revolution of Dignity, and the thing that transcends the election of one individual or another. Whoever is elected, Ukrainians want to see them keep their promises, account to people, cut corruption, and I think that's why there's still, despite all the enthusiasm for Zelensky, a lot of people are waiting to see if that's going to happen. So this is NDI's for the parliamentary election. We will field 6 long-term analysts looking at different thematic areas, and then a high-level short-term election observation mission, and we'll issue a public statement right afterwards. Okay, so these are I'm going to go quickly, these are our recommendations from our presidential election mission. Recommendations to, like IRI, we found that the election generally met democratic standards and reflected the will of the Ukrainian people, but we also offered recommendations in the spirit of constructive cooperation and joint efforts to make the electoral system even stronger. And I do agree with Steve that in the parliamentary election there's likely to be more of a Russian attempt to disrupt. Because this time there's a real Russian-oriented player in the elections, it's the opposition bloc. Okay, so these recommendations probably can't be done, especially if it's in July. Okay, but they highlight some of the areas that needs to be looked at. Let's just look at some of them. Draft law 8270. This is about penalties for vote buying, which is obviously very popular. Vote buying with penalties. Draft number 6240. This addresses a question that Steve has also raised, an issue that Steve also raised, that then the NDI's delegation found throughout the country that their procedures for internally displaced people and labor migrants are very burdensome to change their place of residence and to vote. That needs to be addressed. Okay. Participation of women, always an issue. Social media, I'm not going to get into that a lot. We did see some steps by social media. with Facebook to help, to make more transparent the people behind political ads, but there's more to be done. Okay, so here's recommendation for the next 7 weeks, assuming that we have 7 weeks. CEC should ensure all deliberations are open to accredited domestic and international observers. There were complaints in the presidential election that domestic and international observers didn't get the same level of transparency from the CEC. Of course, prosecutors should pursue proportionate punishment and enforcement of election laws. Election observers should operate in accordance with the Declaration of Global Principles. One thing we did not see in the last election that a lot of people thought would happen is people accredited as observers who actually come from paramilitary groups and purposes to disrupt. That did not happen. Election-related materials being made accessible across Ukraine. Polling places are not accessible to people with disabilities. Skipping down, obviously we refrain from making unsubstantiated allegations about the integrity of the process. That just plays right into Russian disinformation. And then the 2 on inclusion, parties and campaigns should be more inclusive of LGBTI, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities. Obviously, we would have liked Parliament to have considered gender quotas. That doesn't look like it's going to happen. That is it for me. I hope that was helpful. And I would be happy to answer questions.
Katie, thank you. That was incredibly helpful to walk through that, particularly the recommendations in this interim period as well, but also walking through the numbers, both in terms of sort of parliamentary elections. And I think you can see that there's still a lot of space based on your numbers in between now and the elections for different parties. And I think as Steve mentioned the breakdown in terms of single mandate seats and others, and how that might impact who ends up winning in this election, but also the impact potentially of pro-Russian parties, something important to watch. If I can now, I'm going to turn it over to Orest to sort of pick up, and also there's this panel is also looking beyond just elections, but also at a number of other challenges, including rule of law, human rights, media. Orest, I'm not going to ask you to comment on all those, but maybe you are. But when we do a final grading, we'll also give a grade on some of those issues as well. Orest, can I turn to you?
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you. I'm going to focus on mostly human rights today, and I'm also going to address, even though it's not part of the grade, human rights in the occupied territories, because I don't think that's actually covered anywhere else in the country, and it needs to be, I think, discussed and highlighted. I'm not going to talk about the election. Steve and Katie did an excellent job of that, except to say I was also an observer for OSCE. The OSCE, NDI, IRI, all the legitimate international observers basically concurred. You know, these elections were basically free and fair. They were competitive. They reflected the will of the people, which is not to say, too, they were perfect or completely problem-free, but that's a separate discussion. So on to Russian-occupied Ukraine. The human rights, freedoms, democracy situation for millions of Ukrainian citizens of Crimea and the occupied territories is nothing short of appalling. It affects 10 to 15% of the population. You know, we all know about the more than 13,000 deaths, tens of thousands of other casualties, the humanitarian crisis affecting nearly 5 million people, at least 1.3 million IDPs, or that's the amount that's registered, who have left the occupied territories. So clearly Russia's brazen assault on a rules-based international order, including violating all 10 core foundational principles of the OSCE's Helsinki Final Act, have not only geopolitical consequences, but they affect the real lives of real people, of Ukrainian citizens. Now, the State Department's latest human rights country report on Ukraine in discussing the situation in occupied territories just captures how bad the situation is. You see enforced disappearances, torture, unlawful detention, home searches, threats. In Crimea, this especially applies to those peacefully resisting the occupation, which tends to be Crimean Tatars, as well as pro-Ukrainian activists. And indeed, these groups also face linguistic, educational, and cultural discrimination. Both of the occupied territories, surprise, surprise, are characterized by severe restrictions of freedom of expression, press, association, assembly, etc. In addition, in the occupied territories of Donbass, the Russian-led forces commit gender-based violence, they restrict movement of the line of contact in eastern Ukraine, and unduly restrict humanitarian aid. On the religious rights front, a U.S. government commission on international religious freedom described the Russian proxy warlords in the Donbass as deeply suspicious towards religious groups other than the Russian Orthodox Church. They continue to persecute religious minorities through legal restrictions, confiscation of property, prosecution of clergy, harassment of congregations, etc. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, formerly of the Kiev Patriarchate, but now the name's changed, as you know, Jehovah's Witnesses and various Protestant denominations are especially hard hit. Crimea, the situation's similar, although there also the Crimean Tatars and other Muslims are persecuted for their religious beliefs as well. Bottom line is human rights, rule of law, and democracy in the so-called republics in Crimea is nothing but a sham. Now, some 115 Ukrainian citizens, including 70 from Crimea, names that might be familiar to you, such as Sentsov, Polchenko, Bolu, Hussein Kuku, Zakirov, Umerov, Viv, Glig, Sushchenko, and others, are unjustly imprisoned in either Crimea or the Russian Federation for their political views or religious beliefs. And this is ongoing, this continues. So just in the last few weeks, we have more reports of torture of some of these people in Russian detention. Also reports in the DNR and LNR of confiscation of homes and the continued holding of reportedly several hundred, the exact number isn't known for various reasons, hostages and prisoners of war, as well as the forcible handover of Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the Moscow Patriarchate in the Donbass. And then we have the 24 crew members detained, in the Kerch Straits back in November. Russia continues, as we know, to detain them, despite the recent UN International Law of the Seas or Maritime Tribunal ruling ordering the Kremlin to immediately release them. And of course, the Kremlin's been thumbing its nose at that, as they have on so many other things. So, to conclude this part, Moscow's ongoing repression of Ukraine's sovereign territories has left numerous victims in its wake. I think in some ways it's more reminiscent of the late Soviet period, the Brezhnev period, than it is of 21st century Europe. And one can't give anything, I know this grade doesn't count, but what they get is basically a big fat F on that. Both are black holes as far as human rights are concerned. And by the way, this whole complex of human rights issues, the sort of gap between occupied and the rest of Ukraine, including such issues as property rights, which the Russians and their proxies have violated with impunity, will only complicate any peace settlement negotiations, and those are going to be tough enough to begin with. Now, on to Ukraine proper, or Kiev-controlled Ukraine. So compared to the occupied territories, Ukraine's a relative paradise. I say relative. The government does generally respect rights and freedoms of speech, association, media, religion, but not always. There's room for improvement. And that's why Ukraine, according to the authoritative Freedom House rankings, you have free, partly free, and not free as the categories, only remains still at partly free. Snapshot comparison, maybe for your interest, with their neighbors. Russia and Belarus, no surprise there, not free. Slovakia, as well as Romania and Bulgaria, well, Bulgaria is not quite a direct neighbor, but close enough, but those two countries I mentioned, because they're the poorest EU countries, in some ways more similar to Ukraine, but both of them are in the free category. As is Poland, although there's been a little bit of slippage in Poland in recent years. And then there's Ukraine's neighbor Hungary, which under that great friend of Ukraine, Viktor Orban, yes, I'm being sarcastic, that has deteriorated to partly free and is the only EU country which is partly free. And then neighboring Moldova, you may have heard there's a little bit of ongoing political turmoil there right now. It's similar to Ukraine in many respects, including sort of suffering from the disease of corruption, but they're also in the partly free category. Ukraine, just to remind people, was actually in the free category for about 3-4 years when Yushchenko was president, but they lost that status before Yanukovych came to power, or after, when Yanukovych came to power, I should say. So Ukraine be further along, possibly back in the free category, I think, if it weren't for the ongoing Russian aggression. The war, for instance, just to cite one example, aggravates the tension between national security and free speech issues. And that's not unknown even in more advanced democracies such as our own country and European countries, some European countries. And there's definitely a gray area here. But that doesn't mean Ukraine shouldn't strive to do better. They've been in a free category before, and they can do it again. So just a few areas that Ukraine needs to work on. Again, according to the State Department annual country report, there were human rights issues even in government-controlled Ukraine, including sometimes, frankly, torture, arbitrary arrests, incommunicado detention, and other abuses committed. And I'm going to quote the department's report. In the context of the Russia-induced and fueled conflict of the Donbas region, obviously these kinds of abuses are much more prevalent and systematic in the DNR and LNR. But then you have long-standing problems, and they're not unique to Ukraine, problems that aren't necessarily war-related, including abuse of detainees by law enforcement, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prison and detention centers, arbitrary arrests and detention. And a big issue has been the government's failure to adequately address steps to prosecute or punish officials who committed abuses resulting in a climate of impunity. Whether it's alleged human rights abuses committed occasionally by the SBU. The SBU does a great job in many areas, but they've been known to take a few shortcuts, if you will, occasionally in the human rights sphere. Or, for that matter, the perpetrators of the 2014 Euromaidan shootings in Kyiv, who have yet to be brought for justice. And also, we've seen a spate of attacks on human rights defenders and anti-corruption activists. The best-known case was the Katz case, who died after an acid attack. And you know, as well as attacks on journalists, and these remain a problem. There were more than 50 attacks last year, and many are not properly investigated by authorities, especially local authorities, who sometimes allegedly are also complicit, you know, including this initially happened in the Katz case, but following public pressure, and this is also a testament to Ukraine's vibrant civil society. And just last week, 5 men who planned and attacked her received jail sentences for between 3 and 6 years, although those who ordered the killing have yet to be prosecuted. I'm not going to go into the media, of course, for the lack of time. Media freedom and internet freedom ratings also from Freedom House are partly free. In part, that's for national security related issues, and I'll leave it at that. Although the Ukrainian media, as we all know, it's a complicated picture, but it is vibrant, pluralistic, independent. There's plenty of criticism of the government and of corruption. So, and then, while the rights of ethnic and other minorities are by and large respected, the Roma still face violence and discrimination, as they do in many other countries in Europe, as do other groups, sometimes, for example, LGBT, mostly from far-right neo-Nazi groups who disrupt their meetings occasionally. So to conclude, it's impossible to cover everything, you know, but the grade I'm going to give Ukraine right now is a B-, which, if I remember correctly, was similar to my assessment from last year Okay, I'm talking about Kiev-controlled Ukraine, of course. So one can point to freedoms generally being respected, democratic elections, which Steve and Katie talked about, and which I saw too, with the OSCE. And areas of small progress in the rule of law areas, such as establishment of an anti-corruption court. And just the other day, the Constitutional Court ruled that forcing anti-corruption activists to provide their e-declarations of income is unconstitutional. That's a positive step, because that had been an issue and a problem. At the same time, we saw a lack of progress and even some backsliding in other areas, such as the taking away of criminal liability for illicit enrichment. And just last week, unfortunately, the Rada voted down Zelensky's anti-illicit enrichment law. If we would, for example, I think, have seen passage and even the beginnings of implementation of laws that have been introduced back in 2017 but have gone nowhere since then, such as electoral reform with, and I'm biased towards this, an open party list system, or on parliamentary immunity or other anti-corruption measures, or more efforts to strengthen anti-corruption architecture by stopping political interference into NABU and others, or greater independence of the judiciary, or comprehensive reform of the SVU, especially getting it out of dealing with economic crimes where there's a lot of corruption, letting it do what it does best, countering Russian aggression, or fewer attacks on anti-corruption activists and journalists, then I would gladly have given a higher grade. And let's see and let's hope that with the new president, government, and Rada, this year Ukraine will be able to move into the free category and maybe instead of a B- have a A- when we meet again next year.
Well said, and I'm glad that you pointed out the occupied territories, because I don't know if there's a special place for a grade there, but obviously what's taking place here in terms of human rights is important and needs to be focused on both in Crimea and the Donbass as well. I also want to thank you for recognizing the importance of civil society protection. This has been one area where the government has previous government promised to do more. I hope that this new government will prosecute those responsible for attacks on civil society and journalists, and that's particularly important. I think we're at the grading point right now. I know you just gave your grade. I also wanted to just chime in to thank you for talking about judicial reform, anti-corruption. I give it a little harder grade because I've seen where there has been a lack of implementation of laws that have been passed that look great but have not been fully implemented, including e-declarations and the lack of prosecuting those, even despite the fact that there is public knowledge of wrongdoing, the inability of courts that are not independent, or the interference in actions of NABU and those that are responsible for addressing corruption. And so looking at that, obviously agree with you and others on the elections as well in terms of grade. Independent media, my one beef is the fact that in terms of independent media, as long as you're associated particularly with an oligarch that controls the media or a portion of that media, then you have access to the public, without which, and that's why I think even by looking at Zelensky, he clearly had the ability he enjoyed a certain aspect of media ability or ability to access it that others may not have in the electoral process. But when I look at all those things, and I agree with you, the unique part of this is that Ukraine should be a model in terms of democracy, human rights, free media in this region, elections. And I'm struck by what Steve said of Russians watching the debates, watching what took place in Ukraine. And I know that we're looking across this region where we see a tremendous amount of democratic backsliding on Ukraine's borders, EU member states, NATO member states. Ukraine should chart its own course in these areas and be the bulwark for democracy, regardless of what happens in its neighborhood. So I'm going to give a C+, and I also hope that the new presidential administration, new parliament coming up, that they will pick up this mantle of change. And when I think about Katie's, about looking at areas where people were disappointed with Poroshenko, these are exactly the areas where reforms didn't meet expectations and corruption. And Anders and others who are coming next will talk about economic reforms and progress. But in order to have the type of economic growth that Ukrainians want, they're going to have to address these issues that stand in the way of Ukrainians really fulfilling their own potential economically and democratically in this region. So, Katie, I give a C+. Orest, you're a B-. Katie?
You guys are really tough graders.
Yes, I was going to say.
So I'm not one of your students.
It was
A couple things. Orest, I really appreciate and agree with your survey of where the progress is and where the deficits still are. NDI doesn't like to give these grades. Sorry for attending on false pretenses, but I believe that it's more the Ukrainian people's right to judge their government and progress, and we are there to help. That said, I will say that I think that there is an opportunity for that judgment to be made coming up very soon with this new administration, or right now actually with the Zelensky administration. There is an opportunity for them to demonstrate that they are going to pursue and even more forcibly pursue the reforms that were started since Euromaidan. The Zelensky team was relatively silent on policy positions in the campaign period, and also, as everybody knows, they have a relatively inexperienced team. Yet, expectations are high, initial indications are strong, and they have an opportunity. I guess what I want to say is they have an opportunity to raise Ukraine's grade for next year if they take that up.
Save the days.
Well, as to grading procedure, I'm a Georgetown man, so I don't believe in grade inflation. But I also have the luxury of addressing and grading the elections, which we consider to be one of the great progressions for Ukraine in the past year. So on that basis, because of what I said about the elections, reflective of IRI's official election observation report, I'm going to give Ukraine a B+ on elections. However, that's contingent on the parliamentary elections being as well-run, well-administered, peaceful, and calm as the presidential elections were. And again, because of the threat of outside influences, that's at play right now. So we'll have to see. So that grade is contingent on what happens in the parliamentary elections.
I'll just add, if it was on the elections alone, I would have also given a B+ for what that's worth. But I think we're encompassing a little bit more.
I would agree on that too, and I'll just I want to give a grade for the United States. I think this is not included, but I want to say that for the last 5 years post-Maidan, the U.S. and others have stepped up to support Ukraine, and I think it's sort of a bit inclusive too. There's a change in Ukraine, a new government. I hope new momentum, as Katie pointed out, and I really hope for U.S. policymakers that are thinking really clearly about how to take Ukraine. I think also I agree with Katie that the Ukrainian people should be the ones determining sort of the outcome of what their government is doing. And international partners have to look at the progress to determine how best to support Ukraine. And so that front, I hope that support continues, but also adjusts so they can also be part of raising Ukraine's grade from where they are today, whether it's partially free with nations in transit, but up to the space where we want Ukraine to be as a partner and ally. So on that note, if you could just join me in thanking our speakers. And we'll be welcoming up the next panel in a second. Thank you.
And Katie,